Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day number 1106, 1106, Saturday, April the 18th, 2020. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so the big news obviously yesterday was the release by the Senate Judiciary Committee of some serious documents. A major release. Of course, I'm sure you're all aware of this by now. If you follow this story, I'm sure that you've heard all about it. Some of you may have already started reading some of these documents. I think there's a couple things I want to focus on here. First, the documents themselves. The main ones that we would all be mostly interested in, although there's a lot of good stuff in there. The main one is the main 4 or 5 that caught my attention that were released were the transcripts from confidential human sources related to the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. I haven't even started reading on that yet. Then we have the transcripts with the confidential human sources, 2 of those with Papadopoulos. This is the 2 confidential informants who are wearing a wire having a conversation with Papadopoulos. One of them is, of course, the one with Stefan Halper, the fat man, and the other one, of course, is this I forget his name now, but he was a person who Papadopoulos worked with at a think tank, and that was the second person who wore a wire and had a conversation with Papadopoulos, and I have this is where I started. Okay, so these are the 2 that were most interesting to me. So I started reading. I got through all of the stuff on Halper conversation, I think we could call it. And I think the thing that stood out to me the most, having read through all that, was how hard that Halper was pushing Papadopoulos. I mean, I would have been very suspicious if it were me and someone were, really pressing me as hard as Halper was pressing Papadopoulos on the Trump-Russia collusion and just all these other little things that he was touching on. They were like, I was feeling pressure just reading it, and I can imagine if I were the one actually in that situation, like Papadopoulos, and I got this guy pressing me. I'm surprised that Papadopoulos was as patient as he was. So I've read through all of that. I didn't take any notes. I just wanted to kind of read through it all, because like a lot of people, this happened after the news cycle. It happened after the daily news cycle, after I'd already done my video and everything. And so I just started reading, right? I didn't even think about taking notes or whatever. I just wanted to read that entire transcript between Papadopoulos and Halper. And then, of course, there's the other one, which I'll begin reading tonight. And then, of course, that was the 2 things that I jumped on right away. The two transcripts of the confidential human sources with Papadopoulos. And, of course, they also have released all 4 of the Carter Paige FISA warrants almost completely unredacted. I just took a real quick look at the first one last night, just kind of scroll down and look at it to see how unredacted it was, and it's pretty damn unredacted. So you have all 4 of Carter Paige's FISAs, and then there's another probably 2 or 3 dozen other documents that Lindsey Graham has released here. And one of them is the letter that Lindsey Graham wrote to the Australian government urging them to cooperate with the investigation. And so there's a couple of the things there, and you can go, in fact, the Senate Judiciary Committee has actually set up a website where you can go directly to their website. Just Google Senate Judiciary Committee, and you'll see it there on the link. And just click on it, and it's the Senate Judiciary Committee's page with everything in PDF. So you can just sit there and click on one document to the next, to the next, to the next, read it all. It's going to take quite a while for everyone to read through all of this. There's a lot there. It's going to take a while to read through it and process it and decide what to think about it. I don't know at this point that there'll be a tremendous amount of new information because we know so much about all of these things now. But I think that there'll be little tidbits of information that will help shore up a few loose ends, let's say. And so it's going to take a little time for obviously the professional journalists, I'm sure, are pouring over it right now. I'll be, of course, reading through as much of it as I can find time to do. I definitely will read both of the Papadopoulos transcripts with the confidential informants. I'll definitely look at the Carter Page FISA warrants. There's a couple other documents there I'm also interested in reading. So it's going to take some time to go through it. But, a lot of people will be pouring over these documents over the next week or two. And I think that a lot will come out of that. Again, we know the bulk of things that were going on with Papadopoulos, the confidential informants, and the Steele FISA warrants because of the IG report, because of other reporting, the fact that we've all been on this story for 2.5 years now. So we know a lot, but there's these little details that still may not have answers to, and it's those little details that we're probably focusing on right now. So I'll keep you posted and abreast of things as I learn them through reading these documents, as well as looking into what other people are finding as they read through these documents. But it was a major document dump by Lindsey Graham and the Senate Judiciary Committee. So there's a lot to be sorted through here, and we'll just have to go through it document at a time and follow it. Now, I think just in general, my thoughts on why Attorney General Barr went ahead and approved the release of these things now, because many of they've been calling on Barr to release for a long time. Devin Nunes had called it his bucket list, and now you're talking most of the things that Nunes wanted released are here. So I guess my original thought was when these documents were dumped and I first discovered it, probably I guess about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night is when I first saw it pop up, and I was surprised. I went over and looked at it, and it was legit. And I saw the link for the Senate Judiciary website, and I thought, wow, this is incredible. They've dropped all these documents. These are all the ones Nunes and other people have been talking about. And I guess I thought, why now? After all this time, it's been, I guess, almost a year now since a lot of these people, Grassley and Graham and Nunes and all these people, have been calling for these to be released. And so I guess the timing, to me, is what's pretty interesting right now, until I actually can get into all of these documents. And my thoughts are, my first gut instinct on the timing of this is, we have this drop of all this information right now, and we just had 2 days before that the Barr. Remember, all this has to be approved by Attorney General Barr. So Barr has just approved the release of all these documents almost completely unredacted. I mean, there's literally hardly any redactions in a lot of this stuff. And 2 days prior to that, we get the declassification of those footnotes, which talk about this Russian disinformation. Prior to that, we have Barr doing this interview with Laura Ingraham, where he basically says, oh yeah, I mean, we're looking to prosecute people. A report, maybe there'll be a report. That's not what John Durham's all about. He's all about prosecuting people who committed these crimes. And then he goes on to say it was a travesty what happened to the president. He's not saying if we find out these things. He very matter-of-factly said to Laura Ingraham that there's going to be prosecutions, that it was a travesty. In other words, these things did happen. The coup is real. It did happen. That's basically what he said in the interview. So all these things happening within the period of a week to 10 days. Barr's very blunt interview, where he makes no bones about the fact that there's going to be people indicted, and that this was essentially a coup. He doesn't use that word, but he says sabotage the president, and he talks in very matter-of-fact terms. He doesn't talk in terms of if we find out, if the evidence is this or that. He's very matter-of-factly saying, that this all happened. Then we get this declassification of the footnotes. Then we get the drop of all these documents. So what is it that I think all this means? Well, I think what all this means is that John Durham is very, very close to dropping the first indictments, of which I believe there will be dozens of indictments of high-level officials from the Obama administration. Obviously, the top three on the list will be Clapper, Brennan, and Comey. They're the first three big fish that are obviously going to be going down. Then you have the next tier, which is your pre-step. Peter's been stroking us, Lisa Paige, McCabe, the lawyer, what's his name? He's definitely in trouble. And just like I said, I've had a list before. Looks like about 2 to 3 dozen people right off the top. Just the first group. There'll be more after that, but that first group. And so I believe that what Attorney General Barr is thinking is that, okay, Durham has obviously told him that he's getting ready to start dropping his first indictments. Now, this is going to be a shock to the system, and it's also going to bring a lot of political heat on Barr and Durham and Trump, because Barr knows that the opposition is going to immediately come out and question everybody's credibility. His, Durham's, Trump's. They're going to try to twist and spin this into, this is Trump using Barr and Durham to get back at his political enemies. And they're going to try to make it a political thing. And Barr understands this very well. He also understands that there's going to be millions and millions of people in the country who've just not been following this story or not been paying attention. They have no idea that any of this is going on. They have no idea what went on in 2016 at all. And just to come out one day and have, a U.S. attorney start indicting former super high-level officials and talking about essentially coups and things and such like that, you're talking about rattling people, especially on the heels of this coronavirus and all the stress that that's creating. I mean, so Barr understands that you don't want to just hit people over the head with a sledgehammer with something that's this big. Because remember, we're talking about the biggest political scandal in history. There's nothing that comes even close. I mean, this makes Watergate look like a simple B&E or something. I mean, this is mega big. So I think that I think that Barr, what he's doing by doing that interview with Ingram, by okaying the declassifying, releasing the footnotes from the IG report, releasing all these documents here. This is all being done through Attorney General Barr. He's the final word on the subject. So I believe that the reason that he's doing all this is to soften people up a little bit or prepare them for what is coming, so that when Durham starts dropping these indictments, it's not a big surprise, because people will say, well, a couple of months ago, we saw these documents which told us this happened and this happened and this happened, and then of course a week later, then we get this and this, and a week later we get this and this. So, in other words, this sort of trickling out a little bit of a time at a time of this evidence. What we're talking about here is evidence. The allowing bits and pieces of the evidence to trickle out over a period of a couple weeks, maybe a month or two, will kind of prepare people so that when Durham comes out and starts prosecuting people, it's not a huge shock to their system. It's like, oh, well, I figured that would probably happen because of what we learned from, a couple weeks ago when we learned about this or learned about that. So I think that part of what Barr is doing is sort of preparing the battlefield, I guess you would say. He's sort of softening people up, getting people prepared for what is coming out. I think that is one part of it. I think the other part of it is to make it perfectly clear to the people, the perpetrators, the criminals, that their time is up and that they're not going to get away with it, and that Durham is going to prosecute them. He's going to charge them and prosecute them. And Barr wants to make that perfectly clear. Why is that? Well, because we're at this point in Durham's investigation where probably with documents, grand jury testimony, other witnesses, he's probably got about as much as he's going to be able to get without the coup plotters, some of them, coming forward and turning state's evidence and just coming clean, telling what they were involved in, and giving up people above them. So I think that a part of this is to soften people up and get them ready for the release, or get them ready for the indictments that are surely going to be coming down on these high-level former Obama administration officials. And it's also to motivate the coup plotters to act In other words, to have their attorney contact Durham and say, okay, my client, so-and-so, Comey, Brennan, Clapper, whatever, my client would like to come in and talk about your investigation. He would be interested in cooperating with your investigation. And once people know who are involved in a criminal operation, once they know that they're in deep trouble, this is usually what they do. They go get a lawyer. They say, okay, they go get a lawyer and they say, okay, there's this investigation going on. I think I may be caught up in it. And at which point the lawyer is going to say, well, do you feel like you could be facing some type of criminal liability? At which point, don't give me specifics. Don't tell me specifics. Just tell me, do you feel that you may be possibly getting caught up in something of a criminal nature where you could be facing some issues? And at which point the person might say, yeah, I think I could get caught up in something like that. At which point that lawyer is almost always 90% of the time to say the best thing you can do is go cooperate. Because if you think you're going to be caught, you're probably going to be caught. And you don't want to be the 10th guy in line because everyone else who's involved with you knows the same thing. And once they all realize that the game is up, there'll be a mad dash to Durham's door with their lawyer to try to cut a deal, to try to lessen the damage or what have you. So I think that Barr, again, I think the two major reasons he's done these releases, the big one he did yesterday, the one he did a couple days before, declassifying the footnotes, and then of course that was following the interview he did with Laura Ingraham. I think the reason for all of these things is no accident. I think he is, number one, preparing people for what's about to happen, which is going to be a shock to the system for a lot of people. It's going to be a political football, and he knows that. He wants to get out ahead of that. But I think even more importantly, probably the most important reason, is he wants to motivate the coup plotters to throw up the white flag, get their attorney, and go into Durham's office and start talking. I think that is what we're looking at here. And I expect that Barr will continue to approve releasing documents over the next few days, maybe the next couple of weeks. But at this point, I would have to say that if we're at this point, that I would just have to say that we are very, very close to Durham starting to lay indictments. This process is going to take a while. But I think that there's probably a period where Barr and Durham are going to give these people a few weeks to get their attorney, because they've now been told. They've been told that there's no doubt in anybody's mind. Certainly not in my mind or your mind. There's absolutely no doubt in Brennan, Comey, Clapper. There's no doubt in any of these guys' minds based on what based on what Barr has said, based on documents that have been released. They know that they're about to be in the crosshairs. And it's at this point that they're going to go get lawyers, if they don't already have them. And it's this point that their lawyers are going to advise them to cooperate. And I think that Barr and Durham are going to give them that window, and I believe that's why all this is happening, is to give them probably a 30-day window for these people to come in and take their best shot at getting a deal. So I think that we're within 30 days, could be even less, of the first indictments coming down. I believe it will happen in a series of indictments. You'll get indictments of maybe a half dozen people, maybe a week or two later a couple more, then some more. I think when it's all said and done, 2 to 3 dozen high-level people will be facing indictments. I think nearly every damn one of them, I don't think they'll even go to trial. I think they'll cop plea agreements. Almost every one of them will cop plea agreements. And then I think once that's over, Durham will probably have criminal referrals on dozens and dozens of other people who were minor bit players who went along but weren't actually the plotters. They're just people who went along and did things they shouldn't have done. So I think there'll be an additional fallout of several dozen more people. But I think that the top people who were involved in all this, I think they've got about 30 days probably to go to Mr. Durham and come clean, or else I think the indictments are very close, within probably 30 days. So that's my general take on the big document release from yesterday. We also had John Solomon on Lou Dobbs, saying that he wouldn't be surprised if indictments are not coming up in the next week or two. I think Barr and Durham are probably going to give a little time, but not much. A couple of weeks, a month probably tops. If these guys don't come in with their lawyers and decide to talk within a month, they're probably going to get indicted. We also have Papadopoulos tweeting out that he says that Durham knows who tapped Alexander Down the Hatch Downer to meet with him. Yeah, I think we've discussed this many, many times. Who was it? Who was it that motivated Downer to meet with Papadopoulos? And of course, I have two guesses. One would be Stefan Halper, would be my first guess. But my second guess, and probably maybe the more correct guess, is Bill Priestap. And of course, because we know that 2 days before Downer meets with Papadopoulos, Priestap was in London. Priestap's in London on May the 8th. On May the 10th, Downer and Pops have that conversation. Then, of course, Peter's Been Stroking Us was there the week after. So 2 days before Downer makes this meeting with Papadopoulos, Priestap's in London. Then a week after the Downer Papadopoulos meeting, Peter's Been Stroking Us is in London, probably for a debriefing. So my guess is that Bill Priestap is probably the one who tasked Alexander Down the Hatch Downer with meeting with Papadopoulos, and if it wasn't Priestap, it was likely Halper. That's my two guesses. We had a report about a week and a half ago that a high-level member of the intelligence community had lawyered up. It's now being reported by Brad Johnson, former CIA station chief. He's been following the Spygate story and writing a lot on it, that person is Gina Haspel. Gina Haspel. Remember, she was the section chief in London during 2016 when all of this was going down. And she has been, since being back as the CIA director, she's been doing a lot of covering up. So now Brad Johnson reporting it is Gina Haspel who is lawyered up. And she should. She has a lot of problems, most of them legal. We are now learning more about the Carter Paige physical searches that we talked about the other day from this document release. We know that the places where they entered to do, physical, searches was hotels. There were 2 hotels that Carter Paige stayed at, and it was those 2 hotels that FBI agents entered and did searches. And we also know that while in the process of doing that, in both of those cases, they took photos. And we now know from, again, this report that the photos were illegal. What that means, I don't know. But something either that they photographed, maybe they photographed something they shouldn't have photographed, I don't know. We don't have the details. We just know that the 2 properties that were searched for that physical search warrant on Carter Paige on 2 different occasions, physical searches occurred in 2 hotels. And in the process of doing that, the FBI took illegal photos. And the documents that prove that were part of the release that we just had yesterday. There are also a lot of people drilling down now on the previous release of the declassified footnotes and starting to add that up. And now it's becoming pretty likely that when they talk about in those declassified footnotes about one of Steele's sub-sources being a Clinton supporter, at first when I read it, I thought it meant that this Russian, so-called Russian intelligence officer who may have been giving Steele misinformation, I thought they meant that he was a Hillary Clinton supporter. And while that may be true, there is now people who are digging into this and suggesting that maybe Steele was also getting information from people actually within the Clinton circle. And I think there we would be talking most likely about Cody Shearer and Sidney Blumenthal, one or both. Or possibly using Jonathan. Now we know that Jonathan Weiner gave information to Steele that he got from Shearer. Now maybe that is what they're talking about. I'm not aware at this point that Shearer or Blumenthal directly communicated to Christopher Steele any information. We know indirectly they did. We know that that Shearer used a intermediary to get Steele information, and that ended up finding its way to the FBI. And that was, of course, using Jonathan Weiner, this State Department official. So what I'm finding now is a lot of people believe that there was a direct connection between people within, which would be very weird because Hillary Clinton's paying Christopher Steele to dig up dirt, and this would be suggesting that she actually had people in her campaign feeding her store. So she pays the guy to go dig up dirt, and she's also got, I guess, people in her circle feeding the guy who she's paying to get the dirt. Now, if that turns out to be the case, things get a lot more complicated for the Right Reverend Clinton and the coup plot. We also learned from this release that Christopher Steele did lie to the FBI about being the source for the Yahoo News article, which, of course, was written by Michael Isikoff. Steele apparently said, when he was interviewed by the FBI, when they were asking about these media leaks and stuff, he apparently told them that he was not the source for the Yahoo News article. And, of course, he was. So, if Durham wants to talk to Christopher Steele, he now doesn't have to worry about having a reason. He now has a reason to subpoena Christopher Steele and have him extradited, if need be. He's caught in one lie, and I'm sure there's many more. That's just the one that's obvious and glaring from the recent release. John Solomon was on with Dan Bongino, and they also discussed what I was just talking about, this Hillary Clinton supporter possibly being a direct source for Christopher Steele. And they also discussed this Russian intel officer being possibly a Clinton supporter and that information being given to the FBI. Mueller certainly would have known about that. Andrew Weisass certainly would have known about that. Jenny Rhee certainly would have known about that. All the people, top people, the FBI, DOJ would have known about that. So they discussed that. They also discussed the fact that the FBI knew that Christopher Steele's primary source was Sergei Milian. And they knew that. The FBI knew that Milian was Steele's primary source at the very time that Milian himself was under FBI investigation for an unrelated matter. So think about that for just a second. This is what Solomon and Bongino are talking about, and they're really drilling down on this point, and it's a very good point to drill down on, because think how bad that is. Think how bad that is. If you're John Durham and Attorney General Barr and you're learning this, in addition to everything else, that the investigators, the Crossfire Operation Crossfire Hurricane team, are knowingly using and relying on a source, Christopher Steele's primary source, Milian, when they know that at the very time that they're going to use this primary source to get FISA warrants, that he himself, the source of Steele's information, is under FBI investigation. Now, I'm awfully damn sure they didn't mention that to the FISA court. Can you imagine going to the FISA court and saying, yeah, we want a FISA on Carter Paige based on this information that we got from this former British spy who's writing this dossier, and he's discovered these things. And he's got a source, And this source is a guy named Milian. Now, Milian, keep in mind, we're currently investigating him for an unrelated crime. But he's the source, the reliable source that we're going to use to get the FISA warrant, despite the fact that we're also investigating him. I don't think so. So that's very, very bad. That's very bad. And they all knew about it. The whole Operation Crossfire Hurricane team, and certainly I would have to think that James Baker, Mary McCord, Atkinson, Priestep, all these guys had to know it. Had to know it. And there wasn't just one interview with Milian. There was 3 interviews with Milian. There was one that was in January of 2017. There was another in March and another in May. They went back to him 3 times. And the last time they went back to him in May was right about the time, within a few days of when Uncle Bob the Executioner was appointed. That was the 3rd time. Uncle Bob had to know about it. Yet he went ahead anyway. I'm telling you, Uncle Bob the Executioner, Mueller, and that whole Mueller team, they're all probably facing indictments. They were a part of the coup. They weren't duped. They knew every bit of this. Knew every bit of it. Then you also have in this interview with Solomon and Dan Bongino, where Solomon actually tells Bongino, says, "Yeah, you know, I actually, when you look at this, I'm not so sure that Halper wasn't feeding Christopher Steele, either directly or through an intermediary." Yes, is what I've been saying for months and months and months. The Halper was probably feeding Trubnikov, and Trubnikov was feeding Steele. Now, whether Halper was feeding Steele directly is, I don't know. But I do believe that Halper was feeding people who were feeding Steele. I do believe that. John Solomon now believes the same. John Solomon also points out that Steele dropped his very first memo, which would later become Memo 1 of the 13 memos that make up the dossier. He dropped Memo 1 on July the 5th of 2016. July the 5th of 2016. You know what else happened on July the 5th of 2016? That was the day that Comey came out and exonerated the Rotten Reverend Clinton. The same exact day that Comey exonerates the Rotten Reverend Clinton, Christopher Steele shows up at an FBI office in Rome with his first memo. Unbelievable. You think those two events aren't related?